Chapters 13 and 14 of Seminar 19 are fascinating in several ways, not least of which I'd say is the way that they continue Lacan's running commentary at this point on what might be called the masculine mindset, especially as we've been developing it in this series. Until recently, we've been focused on the masculine subject's fantasy figuration within this mindset of an exceptional man, a real man, a number one all-alone man, whose unlimited, unconstrained, uncastrated, singularly autonomous enjoyment negates the phallic function, or at least promises to do so. In our last lecture, on chapters 11 and 12, we pursued another line of inquiry into the masculine mindset. This one focused on their actually existing partners, wives, girlfriends, husbands, boyfriends. The type of partner doesn't matter. It's the function of the partner that matters to us. And what we saw when we were looking at these actually existing partners to masculine subjects, which are always partners for masculine subjects, what we saw was how the masculine pursuit of phallic jouissance and its surplus sibling tends to reduce others to objects, partners to parts, and all in service to the masculine desire to feel whole. And by whole, you'll recall, I mean autonomous. Here it is, in sum. The heteronomy of the partner relative to the masculine subject is the condition of possibility for the latter's sense of autonomy, which is, of course, a great irony in all of this. Men rely on others in order to feel like they rely on no one. Lo, the masters of mankind. And as we go from man to mankind, I want to remind you again and again, we are not talking about whether or not you have a penis. We are not talking about whether you have a vulva. We are not talking about breasts. We're not talking about what's behind your swimsuit zone. Man is a subject position, the masculine subjectivity. It has more to do with how you enjoy than what is behind your swimsuit zone. Anatomical women can occupy the position of the man in this argument. So it's unfortunate that Lacan is using such loaded gendered terms, but in a way it does capture how things work in heterotypical society, which seems to be the one that he has in mind more than any other in the midst of all this. The same way that you could say the subject that he has in mind in the midst of all this is a neurotic subject, more than an autistic subject, psychotic subject, perverse subject. He's really thinking at the level of the classic Lacanian split subject of neurosis. So if you can hold all of that in mind while he's talking, it keeps the claims a little more modest and humble. And here I think it's worth remembering that when he says men rely on others in order to feel like they rely on no one, more or less, the men in question are subjects who occupy masculine modes of enjoyment. That might be a better way to think about this. And similarly, when we say, lo, the masters of mankind, you can zoom out even further. But let's get back to these chapters that we're working on. Chapter 13 of Seminar 19. It continues this line of thought about relying on others in order to feel like you don't rely on anyone. It continues this line of thought and couples it with what we've already learned about masculine fantasies of the real men they want to be. Before getting into all this wonderful stuff, though, which I believe has a lot to teach us, I want to say a bit about what comes next. Before we get into chapter 13, let's make a Lacanian move and talk about chapter 14, which on my reading, unfortunately, doesn't yield many new insights. And maybe that's a testament to the work that Lacan has done in the first dozen or so chapters or lessons in Seminar 19. that at this point he's summarizing a lot of what he's already said. In fact, I would argue, if you really want to look for what's new in chapter 14 of seminar 19, it's going to come with a bit of frustration, at least for me. And I believe that the newness in chapter 14, in fact, leaves us worse off. Because once more, it shows Lacan trying so hard to outdo Aristotle that he loses sight of his own project, at least on my reading. And once more, we see Lacan doing this at the level of modal logic, where he's slipping, sliding, and struggling to integrate and to revise Aristotelian notions of modality and fit them into his four-parted matheme of sexuation. But I don't want to focus on that. Let's focus on what's good in chapter 14 before we get to what's great in its predecessor, chapter 13, even if only to recall what we've already learned on several topics up to this point in this terrific seminar. Chapter 14, as you know, begins on the discourse of the analyst and reiterates the function of S2 in the position of truth relative to the analyst. There are three key insights that Lacan rehearses here for his audience. First, S2 equals knowledge of the truth of the unconscious. That's one of its main definitions that we've worked with. Remember, we're thinking relative to the analyst here. Relative to the analyst, S2 serves a couple of different purposes. The primary one is it serves as knowledge of the truth of the unconscious. That the analyst then, here's the second point, renounces, represses, and ignores in order, I believe, to be better attuned to the symptomatic expressions of the analysand, thereby allowing for a third move. This third move would be an embrace of what Lacan in his other seminar 19 calls learned ignorance, an embrace of learned ignorance, where the analyst is not the subject supposed to know, that capital A, but something more akin to a fool, a stone, and all en route to rejection. Here is objet A at the end of the five-part sequence that we rehearsed in our last lecture and that we began to scale up in our work on seminar 17. So Lacan is just bringing all this to focus. He's saying that the knowledge of the unconscious atop which the analyst sits is knowledge that is to be renounced, repressed, and ignored in order to cultivate a sense of learned ignorance and thus an ability to remain open to the symptomatic expressions of the analysand, which, as we know, would feed back into the analyst's knowledge of the truth of the unconscious, that knowledge always being porous or bored through by the symptom in order to keep analytic theory edgy, you might say. Now, let's be clear, though. The analyst is not an idiot, and this doesn't make them one. And when I say idiot, I mean that term technically in the Greek sense. The analyst is not an idiot. On the contrary, as we've seen, the analyst's learned ignorance is precisely what drives them in a new intellectual direction. From mythemes, which is what you see in Freud and Levi-Strauss, that's where we get the idea of the mytheme, to mathematics, here Lacan is drawing on Cantor and Frege in particular, Russell a little bit here too, to Lacan's own mathemes. That's what's up here, is you see mythemes going to mathematics and coming out as mathemes of Lacan's very own. You can see this playing out on page 175 of the book. It's great. And I want to say that the primary matheme here is the one that you just heard me cue up, the one that I suggested a long time ago, but that now Lacan is coming to terms with in a way that I think is super productive. He says that this four-formulated structure of sexuation with these four formulas, he's now saying these are a fucking matheme. And that makes a lot of good sense. It's been latent in his work up to this point. Here he spells it out. Why is this a matheme? Because when you stack up all four of these formulas of sexuation, what you see are a series of impasses, oppositions, barriers, obstacles to each other. And that's what defines any Lacanian topology as a matheme, is its ability to articulate, present, preserve, to focus on the impasse, which oddly enough is one of the very things that Lacanians ignore about the basic mathemes that get all this going for Lacan, namely discourse. We like to focus on the four parts of that discourse without focusing on what Lacan generates by way of those four parts, which is the unvectored centerpiece in the bottom that is absent, this delta of impotence, which is why we've tried to offset that tendency by focusing so intensely on it in our past few series. And here's what we've learned about mathemes. They are not just presentations of impasse, they are certain algorithmic structures that are built up around these impasses. The matheme, as we learned in the other seminar 19, when Lacan starts using this term, is an algorithmic structure that allows certain impasses, let me be clear, to become legible. These are written structures that allow for a certain type of reading. And what I mean by impasse, again, let me be clear, is impossibility. The impasses that find expression and come to legibility in Lacanian mathemes are impossibilities, the function of which, as you know, is numerical, and the field of which, as you also know, is real. So the impasses that become legible in a proper Lacanian matheme are impossibilities whose function is numerical and whose field is real. In mathematics, and only in mathematics, according to Lacan, we can, as he puts it here, generate the real from the impossible. It's on page 177, you can check it out. A few pages earlier, though, on page 160, Lacan is even more pointed. And I think it's fair to say that this is the real conceptual centerpiece of what he's doing here. He says on page 160, point blank, the real is mathematical. And the mathematical real, he goes on to insist, anticipating further distinctions to come, he says it has nothing to do with truth, and even less to do with meaning, knowledge, language, ontology, and the like. You can read it, it's right there on page 161. So notice again what's happening here. The real, the true, and the unconscious. Lacan is introducing some fine distinctions between this cluster of terms that we've been working with. The mathematical real has nothing to do with truth, he says, and even less to do with meaning, knowledge, language, and the like. Now, we've known the latter for a while. It's been clear as days since seminar 18, a clarity, unfortunately, that had to come in the middle of the night of the blackboard, but that meaning, knowledge, language, and the like would have nothing to do with the real, the unconscious, and the true. Lacan is now working with the unconscious, the real, and the true to start parsing those things out and to clarify a little bit what's going on there. At this point, though, he is still hot on mathematics. The real is a mathematical real. So, how does this flow? Well, you know how it flows. From languages to words to letters to numbers and ultimately to the written symbols that you see in Lacan's formulas of sexuation. This is the trajectory that is cutting through his analytic theory and technique at this point. So earlier on in the 60s, you saw him make a big fuss about the square root of -1. It's not an imaginary number. It's a complicated number. But here, this is not the one that he has in mind. He's got another one on his mind, a one that he thinks can help him illustrate how the real is mathematical, what the mathematical real is. and keep us on that trajectory from languages to words to letters to numbers and then ultimately to glyphs, to written symbols that do not function clearly numerically or clearly linguistically. This is the writing on the wall that Lacan has been flitting from ever since Seminar 2. And I believe as he arrives at this number 1, he's got one agenda on his mind. You're not going to like this, and I don't like saying this as the agenda point, but it's the word that he thinks he's operating on here, and that word is existence. The agenda item on the table when he cues up the one at this point in his thought is existence. And here's how he puts it on page 176. There is no existence but on the basis of the one. And as you know, if you've read these chapters, the existence of the one is, of course, only mathematical. But we'll come to that in a minute. You know, in particular, the question of existence that's been on his mind. It's again the question of the existence of some one, an exceptional one, whose enjoyment negates the phallic function. At this point, all kinds of terms must be pop into your mind. At this point, a certain formula should be pop into your mind, but also its counterpart. Does this someone, this exceptional one, whose enjoyment negates the phallic function, exist? Does he exist? Men wager yes, and that gives you the first formula on the masculine side. There exists someone whose enjoyment negates the phallic function. Women, however, show up to demonstrate otherwise. And here's the second formula in the top. This is the formula at the start of Lacan's theory of feminine subjectivity. There does not exist someone whose enjoyment negates the phallic function. And so you have these two formulas in opposition to each other, each serving as a barrier to the other. And the question at stake there is one of existence. And that's why at the end of chapter 14 in the diagram that Lacan starts messing with, a diagram that you don't see much of after this, probably for good reason, he squares existence right there between the two upper formulas. This is where he's focused on. This is what he's been working with right now. Does the exceptional one, this someone whose enjoyment negates the phallic function, exist? And the question is, if so, how? Right? This has got him into inexistence as a concept here. But that's not where he's at in chapters 13 and 14. Let's ramp up to it. As I'm sure you've guessed by now, the feminine position is the one that I've asked you to adopt, even and especially in the midst of all this talk we've been doing about the masculine one. It has all been in an effort to push us in the direction of femininity, which doesn't mean you have to have a vulva and breasts in order to get this thing done. No. Feminine subjectivity, like masculine subjectivity, is a subject position that any body can occupy. The feminine position is the one that I've asked you to occupy, men and women. If an exceptional, real man exists, it's only ever at the level of masculine fantasy. In other words, as myth, which is to say that the feminine side of the upper two formulas is more true than the masculine side. There does not exist someone whose enjoyment negates the phallic function. So better to rely on it than on the alternate wager, which is that there does exist someone. Lacan is all over these materials in the middle part of chapter 14. The closest thing we have to an actually existing real man is not a man at all, he reminds us, but instead an orangutan, Abraham's ram, and other non-human animals. You can see it right there in chapter 14. He's fucking around. The father of the primal prehistoric horde, Lacan suggests, wasn't a man, not even a human, but instead an animal through and through. So if you want to claim that that's some real shit in the sense that it actually happened, be clear what you're claiming, Lacan says. The person you're talking about isn't a person at all. It's Abraham's ram that has to be sacrificed, not Abraham's father. At which point, I guarantee that there are some masculinized eyes on this call that have begun to light up. That's right, McCormick. Real men are pure animals. Finally, you're telling us the truth about masculinity. Real men are wild, unchained, uncastrated. They take what they want. They grab them wherever they want because that's what you're allowed to do when you're a real wild man. So there you have it, Sir Beasts, Sire Beasts, Master Beasts, Mr. Beasts of every stripe. You get the idea. And I was thinking as I was walking the dog this morning, like, man, is there like this, how could I come up with just like a great indicative list of these names that capture at the level of a signifier what this beast-like man of the primal horde would be, and the one that would, of course, sustain the masculine fantasy. And then I was reminded of an old roommate I had years ago who used to love professional wrestling. You know, the fake shit. And I remember some of the wrestlers that he used to like, and I love the names of some of these guys. You're going to get the idea. Let me just read some to you. Stone Cold Steve Austin. The Rock, Undertaker. Here's one classic for the record books. You want to know a real man? Here he is. Macho Man, Randy Savage. Hulk Hogan. Roman Reigns. Chris Jericho. That's one for the biblical fans out there. You get a little Chris, you get a little Jericho. How about just Edge? Kevin Nash. The Ultimate Warrior. And for those across the Atlantic, Rowdy Ronnie Piper. Of course, he's American, but there you have it. Andre the Giant. And then the best of all that I just really love here that just captures this. Now, you're not going to think this, but I kind of like this. Dusty Rhodes. Now, what's great about these names, too, is that they also sound like porn star names. Any of these names could be a porn star's name. And what's great about Dusty Rhodes is that you would probably imagine this in a heterotypical setup as a female pornographic name. So you see how these nominations start to go back and forth from the casual, child-friendly Mr. Beast all the way up to the perverse femininity of the hyper-masculine Dusty Rhodes. You get the idea. I don't think I need to continue too far down this path. But here's the danger. Lacan is queuing up the myth of the father of the primal horde as fundamentally, if you keep insisting that it need to be actual, one of animality, of non-human animality. We are not even talking about humans, much less men, when we speak of fathers of the primal horde and shit. Here's the point, though. For Lacan, all of our idolatry and identification with these Randy Savages of the world, all of this among castrated men beholden to the phallic function, is precisely what makes the one all alone, as he calls it, a real one, in the technical sense of an inexistent one, a one that is not outside the discourse of others. Now, we've been talking for a minute here. Let's take a look at the book. Page 178, 179 gives us some good material to support this insight. This is a marker, Lacan says toward the bottom of page 178. And marker go back, we'll check the end note here and go back to the French, and you'll see indeed that he's talking about the daddy, uncut and otherwise. But it's a marker that doesn't hold up even for an instant. That is neither instructive nor teachable if we do not conjoin it with another quantifier that is set down within the four terms, namely the quantifier that is said to be universal. The all men are castrated, he has the formula in here, is the point from which it might be said, as is stated in Freudian doctrine, that the only desire, the only libido, it's the same thing, is masculine. In truth, this is an error, but it is still the case that it's an error that has all its worth as a marker. Now, pay attention to what's happening here, because what Lacan is saying is that this marker that the real one, the real man, as a fantasy figuration serves, it doesn't hold up even for an instant if we don't conjoin it with the category known as all men, with another discourse. In other words, it doesn't make sense outside another discourse, outside the category known as all men and the types of fantastical engagements that characterize those who are placed and positioned in this category. But I told you we got some passages, so let's keep with it here. You saw the one at the bottom of page 178. Let me cue up a little longer one on 179. It's right across the page from it, smack dab in the middle, and it starts, of course, with that formula. There exists someone whose enjoyment negates the phallic function. It is clear, Lacan continues, that what is meant by the formula, there exists someone whose enjoyment negates the phallic function, reaches far enough back to the origin for it to be said that Freud's ignorance of it is utterly confounding. This backwards EX negation of capital Phi X, this at least one, this one all alone, there's the characteristic, which is determined as the effect of naysaying the phallic function. We'll come to the naysaying part in a minute. It's very crucial here. Is precisely the corner beneath which we need to place everything that has so far been said about totem and taboo, so that it can be something other than a myth. Now, one of the things that we've queued up as a kind of like side note, footnote, end note to the end notes that are provided by the translator in this volume is that Lacan keeps apparently mentioning Oedipus and the Oedipal myth. And the translator here, the editor here, let's be clear, is flitting that back and saying, actually, bro's talking about totem and taboo. He's talking about the myth of the father of the primal horde. It's not this Oedipal thing. This has been happening in the past couple of seminars, where Lacan's editors are switching what it is he's mentioning back to something that he's not, this totem and taboo business. This started around seminar 17. It's continuing up to this point. And these endnotes here are marking that, saying, yo, once again, bro is talking about Oedipus, but we're switching it a little bit. Now, I think there's some interesting investigative work that needs to happen here to figure out what this is all about. I don't want to do that work. Why? Because I tend to agree. The myth of the father of the primal horde does indeed seem to be what he's talking about. So the question then becomes, why does he repeatedly mention the Oedipal myth instead? I'll leave that as a question for you, and one that I hope you'll write to me about, because I'd love to hear the answer. This holds all the more interest in that it is not a matter of genesis, Lacan continues, nor of history, nor of anything whatsoever that might resemble an event, even though this is what Freud seems to have called it at some moments. So the father of the primal horde is a mythical father because it doesn't line up with history or any sort of an event, and yet Freud seems to think that it did. It could not be an event in that it is represented for us as standing prior to all history. The father of the primal horde is prehistoric, you see. There is only an event when connoted as such in something that is stated. It's a matter of structure. The myth of totem and taboo is designed in the most patent fashion so that one may speak of all men, of men one and all, as being subject to castration. So again, what you see is the first formula on the masculine side that says there exists at least one man whose enjoyment negates the phallic function. He's saying that this is caught up with, inextricably bound to, this other formula that says all men are subject to castration. These two formulas, he said, don't exist without each other. And here he's focusing on that of the father of the primal horde, of this real man, this one all alone as an inexistent one. We're going to dial this in a moment, but I want you to have these pages in mind because they're doing a really clear job of articulating these two formulas and the types of subjectivities that they co-constitute. Again, the logic that Lacan has in mind when it comes to these two formulas and the subjectivities that they co-constitute, it's not that complicated. Fundamentally, his thought amounts to containers and things contained at this point. Now, albeit he does give things an extimate set theoretical twist, but we are still where we've been since Seminar 14 with Lacan working at the level of container and thing contained. Flip the page, for instance, and join me on page 180, and you'll see what we're up to here. At the point from which we are speaking, we shall not call the fact that there is an exception mythical. This exception is the inclusive function. What is to be stated of the universal, besides that the universal is enclosed by a negative possibility? So the universal in question here is all men are subject to the phallic function. And he's trying to answer what is the inclusive function that props up this universal category, this totalizing set. What is this negative possibility that guarantees the set that is universal here? All men. More exactly, existence here plays the role of the complement, or to speak more mathematically, of the boundary. Thus, somewhere there is an all X. This all X becomes the upside down capital A of the upside down capital A you see in Lacan's formulas, whenever it is embodied in what may be called one being at least, that posits itself as being, and specifically in the capacity of man. Check it out. We know that the mythical, fantastical figure of an exceptional, real man who negates the phallic function, a no man relative to castrative logic, is the no man that guarantees the collection of every man in the field of phallic enjoyment. We've been talking about this since square one. If everything is packed for the camping trip, nothing has been left out. And nothing is indeed something to consider, which is what Lacan is doing here. Here, the reciprocal constitution of these two, everything and nothing, is brought into sharp focus. The exceptional man is the negative possibility, by which I read impossibility, that wanders errantly, phantasmatically through the universal set of all men. And here's the key part, as its limit condition. I told you he's thinking containers and things contained, but with an extimate set theoretical twist, here it is. The exceptional man, captured in the myth of the father of the primal horde, and figured in Lacan's first masculine formula that says there exists someone whose enjoyment negates the phallic function, is a negative possibility. Read impossibility, that wanders errantly and phantasmatically through the universal set of all men that you see in the formula, all men are subject to the phallic function. How? What is its status within this set? It is the limit condition. So if we're talking about a negative possibility, it's a negative condition of possibility. What we're after here is a mythical one being, as Lacan puts it, that includes all men in human being. And that's the careful work that he's starting to do with containers and things contained. Note how he is setting this up. Note the operational logic of this limit condition wandering errantly through the set known as all men. Lacan says that it binds, encloses, and in a truly remarkable way embodies all men. How are we to understand this logic of binding, enclosure, and embodiment that we see in this figure of the exceptional man wandering errantly through the set known as all men? Well, make no mistake, I'm not fucking talking about Whitney Houston. I'm not talking about the one who famously claimed to be every woman. I'm instead inclined to think along the lines of medieval political theology with this shit. The notion in particular of the king's two bodies that I believe culminated in the iconic frontispiece of Hobbes' Leviathan. Check it out. It's from 1651. It's a great cover, guaranteed it's an image you've seen before. The Leviathan that you see in the frontispiece of Hobbes' original publication. This is not the Leviathan of the Bible, I'm sorry, dear friends. Nor is it that of Melville by extension, I'm sorry, dear friends. Nevertheless, the etymology certainly holds up here. The Leviathan that the Father is, that the exceptional real man is, works here. It's the phantasmatic Father in the myths of his murderous sons that does the work of twisting, twining, and joining them together. There's the Hebrew leva. And ever in idolatrous, fantastical identification, to say nothing of worship, with what they suppose to be his magnificent serpent. Now, I'll let you mess with that. I'm just trying to get the other Hebrew etymology here with Thanon. That's how you get Leviathan. It's lava plus Thanon. And I'm sure I'm going to get some notes from folks telling me that I'm mispronouncing these old Hebrew expressions. That's cool, that's fine. This ain't a course in pronunciation. We're reading Lacan and we're looking for a trail that leads us to this thought he's trying to think around an exceptional man as an extimate limit condition that props up and enables and even embodies all men. And what I'm telling you is that it works very much like Hobbes' notion of a Leviathan. But let's make no mistake. This Leviathan, like Hobbes's, is an absolute sovereign that doesn't exist, and yet whose sovereignty guarantees the social contract implicit in Lacan's other formula of masculinity. There's one of the resonances here, this other formula that says all men are subject to the phallic function. And this is what Lacan has been saying since Seminar 17 when he starts to cue this shit up. And you'll recall our comments in that series on Lacan's work with brotherhood and association and the way that the death, read kill, read consumption, of the mythical father of the primal horde is precisely what enables brotherhood, camaraderie, association to exist. And that's not unlike what we're working with here. In fact, it's deeply resonant. This is part of what Lacan is saying. The sons are held together by their idolatrous relationship to a dead daddy, which I believe is the best way to read Lacan's summative statement on this matter in chapter 14. I love chapter 14 for this kind of stuff, for the summative remarks that it makes. It's on the bottom of page 181. The universal is something that results from the envelopment of a certain field by something of the order of one. If you really want a sentence that captures this, that tells you how all the positions fit together, here it is. The universal, read all men are castrated, is something that results from the envelopment, read containment, of a certain field, that of phallic enjoyment, or you might say, by something of the order of one. Here, this would be the one as real one, as exceptional man. I'll let you toy with that. Mainly, I'm just working to get you going on these materials. I think this is yet another way to distinguish masculine from feminine subjects, and I think that is work that we should still consider here. And it's one which we've speculated on before, and which here, toward the end of chapter 14, Lacan fucking confirms. The mythical phantasmatic father, idolized by men, is non-existent for women. He's crystal clear about this on page 182. He says there is a void, a lack, an absence of anything whatsoever that negates the phallic function at the level of women. You want to know the difference? Men have a father, women don't. Again, I would suggest that we recall Hobbes' Leviathan. It definitely comes to mind to me, particularly its cover, that frontispiece, under which you read the following from the book of Job, no less. There is no power on earth to be compared to him. Exactly. That is exactly right. There is no one on earth whose power compares to that phantasmatic figure. Why? Because there is not anyone on earth in existence whose enjoyment negates the phallic function. Now you can go back and read the origin to that in the book of Job, and you'll see the one in question. But I think it's better as the caption to the frontispiece of Hobbes' Leviathan, where you see the image of the absolute sovereign, and you look closely and holy shit, he's completely made up of other people. Just run a search for this. You'll see the image. You'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Here is the one that contains them all. You see? That's partly why I cue up the old notion of the king's two bodies. The one is the body that also contains multitudes. Isn't this precisely why Lacan then goes on to remind us about this key fact of femininity? Namely, that woman is the signifier of the barred other. That algebraic symbol that you see in the upper left-hand quadrant of the graph of desire, that is woman. Lacan's been saying it for the past few seminars. He's back at it again here in seminar 19. Why? Because she doesn't have a father the way that men do. Now, you have to hear that figuratively, right? I'm not saying that women don't have fathers. I'm the father of a daughter. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm not saying that. You have to listen carefully to what I'm saying. They don't have a father the way men have a father. Think capital F father. Think mythical father. Think Randy Savage father. What does that mean? How does that function? This void, lack, or absence of anything in the field of femininity that negates the phallic function. How does it operate? Well, woman's lack of a phantasmatic exception makes her the signifier of the fact behind masculine fantasy. And that's how I've been framing it in this series. Women deal in fact, men deal in fantasy. And when woman shows up the way Lacan says she shows up, it's always to call bullshit on that fantasy, thrusting fact out instead. What might that sound like? Well, I was on the bus the other day, and I heard some shit that sounded a hell of a lot like exactly how this would occur when woman shows up as a signifier of the lack in the other. Here's what I heard. It's almost a direct quote from what I heard on the bus. The totalizing omni-everything that y'all think you are, read big other, is only guaranteed by the delusional belief that there's at least one real man among you. But I'm here, even if only in part, as a part, as not all, to remind you motherfuckers that there's no such man among your ranks. This is some weird shit to hear on the bus, right? And she wasn't done. She also had this to say. Your vaunted big other, dear men, Mr. Beasts, is lacking the very thing that would guarantee it. A living, breathing, speaking figure of non-phallic, uncastrated enjoyment. That's how she serves as a signifier of the lack in the other. All right, I'm not going to fuck around anymore. I'm going to be serious from here on out. One more point by way of conclusion to this odd commentary on chapter 14 of seminar 19, where I'm working hard to talk about what's good in order to avoid mentioning what I think is fucking off the rails. What happens when you add all this up? When you add up all of Lacan's formulas of sexuation, what do you get? I think what you get is the truth of barred subjectivity, a truth which is undeniable, at least for neurotic men and women, and exactly as we described it in our last lecture. The Lacanian subject is a bag with a hole in it, or as Lacan explicitly and repeatedly puts it in these chapters, building on his work in previous couple of chapters, the Lacanian subject is a set, by which we mean, recall our previous lecture, that it's a set with two elements at least. Lack qua zero, and its setification qua one. The subject is a set that, according to Lacan, cannot even be handled without the addition of the empty set. It's page 182, right there. In other words, no hole, no bag. But the opposite is also true. The empty set cannot be handled without its containment or inclusion in a structure, in a set known here as the subject. In other words, no bag, no hole. All of this, Lacan rightly concludes, has nothing to do with language, because, again, it's a matter of number instead, namely that mathematical real with which we began. And again, conceptually speaking, I think this is the primary stake in chapter 13 and 14, this mathematical real. There is no other. But let's stick with men and women for just a moment longer. Again, recalling that these are subject positions. These are modes of being, of enjoying, ways of living, not anything to do with your swimsuit zone. If the Lacanian subject, masculine and feminine alike, is a barred subject, what ultimately distinguishes men and women? It's the obvious question in all of this. If we're all barred subjects, how do we have these two categories, men and women? What distinguishes men and women? The answer is simple: men. To be a masculine subject is to believe that you have access to something that makes you different from and better off than feminine subjects. And that last part is key. It's men who distinguish men and women. And that distinction results in a hierarchy where the masculine subjects believe they have access to something that makes them better off than women. Not the phallus, but the authority, read autonomy, to negate its function. This is what we're talking about here. Somehow, some way, someday, with some say, heard at the level of speech, but also at the level of authority to speak. Men believe that they have access to something that makes them better off than feminine subjects. If you've got ears to hear, in other words, that makes feminine subjects worse. And I'm not talking about the phallus here. I'm talking about the authority to negate its function, to negate the phallic function. You see here how we start edging towards that first formula of masculinity that says there exists someone whose enjoyment negates the phallic function. This is partly what we're after here. Men think they have access and authority to negate the phallic function. It's not about having the phallus, it's about having the authority to negate its function on enjoyment. That's what we're talking about here. What the fantasy figure of the exceptional man yields, in other words, is the promise of an escape via negation from the phallic function, and by extension, castrative logics. It's an escape by way of negation. Not all of women's enjoyment is phallic, but the parts of her enjoyment that are not do not come at the expense of phallic enjoyment. Her other enjoyment, radically ulterior to that of men, does not negate in turn that masculine mode of enjoyment. It's not about escape via negation, as it is for men. And let's be clear again. We are not just talking about any sort of negation. So just as we're not talking about the phallus, but instead the authority to negate its function, we're not just talking about negation. We're talking about negation at the level of speech. The masculine fantasy, hear me now, is at root one of naysaying, of being able to say no to the phallic function. It is about speech. The negation in question that men believe they have authority to perform is one that is performed at the level of speech. Men are the ones who can say no to the phallic function, so the fantasy goes. And this is what makes them better off than women who have it worse. Recall the title of this seminar. I think Lacan is all over this in chapter 14, and it's by far my favorite part in this chapter that I'm working hard to love. I'm just kidding. I think it's great stuff. 178. Check it out. He again starts with the formula for the father as the one who exists, whose enjoyment negates the phallic function. Here, that formula, Lacan says, means there exists an X determined by having said no to the phallic function. The phallic function dominates sexual relation. I write it capital Phi X. You can already see the question of existence being linked to something that we cannot fail to recognize as a fact of saying. It's a saying no. And even, I would say, a nay saying. This is crucial. It is what indicates for us, for our analytic training, the exact point at which we must take up what is stated by set theory. There is at least one who nay says. So here you have, in a nutshell, what's at stake for Lacan. It has everything to do with analytic training. He thinks that the work he's doing right now with the mathematical real and now shifting to the naysayer and so forth is in service to analytic training, to developing analytic theory and technique. He has never lost this focal point, he claims, ever talking about how to help analysts do a better job in the clinic. That's what he says all of this is about. And it amounts to this bumper sticker. There is at least one who naysays. That's how we now start to read the first formula of masculine subjectivity. There exists at least one who says no to the phallic function. Just one hitch, and one that I'm going to reiterate a couple of times so we don't forget it. A basic Lacanian hitch. And here it is. We're talking about naysaying, about the ability and the authority to say no to the phallic function. Just one hitch. In order to say anything, nay or otherwise, using language, in other words, you have to first be castrated, lacking, barred, desirous, and subordinate to, guess what? The phallic function. So there's a profound irony here that masculine subjects think they're better off than women or feminized subjects because they have access to the authority to say no to the phallic function. But the dilemma there is that in order to say anything, you have to prove first, let me be clear, the very fact that you're able to speak proves that you are subordinate to the phallic function. So in order to say no to the phallic function, you can't help but demonstrate in the very same statement that you are subordinate to it. In other words, that you do not have the authority to say no to it. Yet another reason to adopt the feminine position that says there does not exist anyone who can say no to the phallic function, because speech presupposes its superiority. Again, I'm happy to reiterate this. Women prove all of this. And Lacan confirms it as well in commenting on the very formula that I just queued up. It's at the bottom of page 180. I'm trying to give you the one-liners here that serve to really illustrate these points. Toward the bottom of 180, here's what he says. There does not exist any X that is determined as a subject in the statement of naysaying the phallic function. You want to learn how to read anew that upper right-hand formula in Lacan's formulas of sexuation, the first for femininity, that usually says there does not exist someone whose enjoyment negates the phallic function. Here it is. It's in italics on page 180. Lacan is inviting us to reread this formula as saying, there does not exist anyone that is determined as a subject in the statement of naysaying the phallic function. Note again the shift to speech, which is exactly also how we get the masculine fantasy of an exceptional real man who says no to the phallic function. And let me be precise here. It's precisely because there does not, in fact, exist anyone to naysay the phallic function that we, you and I alike, dear barred subject, are tempted to fantasize and idolize and worship otherwise. So much the worse for men. But of course, once more, that's not how they see it. And this is where things get interesting, notably in chapter 13 of seminar 19, which is where I want to shift to now. To start, I want to offer a categorical statement, one that I hope will stick to your ribs, about this masculine mindset that we've been discussing. The masculine mindset is one in which women are worse, men are better, and real men are best. Women are worse, men are better, and real men are best. Which I believe allows us to capture masculine subjectivity in all of its idiocy, and here again I mean that term technically in the Greek sense. In a existential spectrum that I believe is clear, coherent, and readily accessible, where I think we can account for both sides of masculine enjoyment. On the one hand, you've got masculine enjoyment oriented towards the fantasy figure of a real man. Here is the best, towards which men are always drawn. And then there's this other field, oriented towards reductions and reifications of everyone else. Here you have women, here you have the rest. So that's it. The masculine position is one that aspires for the best in order to avoid feeling like the rest. Women are worse, real men are best, and in between are men who have it better than women, so they think. You've heard of the good, the bad, and the ugly, haven't you? Here you've got the better, the best, and the rest. Now, I don't know how that maps on. I mean, if you've seen that film, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, you got to ask yourself, where's Daddy in all this? Who's the Clint Eastwood character? And how about the ugly? You got to wonder how that analogy would play out. But I like this idea of this masculine fantasy being one ultimately at the broadest reach of better, best, and the rest. Let's start, though, with the latter, with the masculine wager that men are better off than women. Or, again, to put it differently, the masculine belief that women, like all the rest, have it worse. Notice how Lacan sets this up at the start of chapter 13. I'm starting here on page 159. And when I say setup, hot damn do I mean a setup. Check it out. It's more or less at the, let's say, a quarter of the way down on page 159. You're going to love this shit. This morning, I got off to the worst start. In spite of it all, I don't think it will be extraneous to let you know about this, if only to see where it might lead. It was due to the brief power cut we had. I don't know how long it lasted for you, but for me, it went on until 10 o'clock. It was a royal pain in the ass, because this is the time of day when I usually gather together these little notes and think them over. The power cut didn't help matters. What's more, this same power cut caused someone to smash a tooth mug, of which I was particularly fond. If there are people here who love me, they can send me a new one, or perhaps even a message to me on Truth Social. Oh, sorry. I read Lacan sometimes, and I can't help but hear his communicative style as a teacher, very much like that of Trump, Donald Trump, in the American political tradition at present. There's this element always of referring back to himself and wondering whether and to what extent people love him, to say the least. I'll comment more on that later, perhaps off the record, but listen to this. If there are people here who love me, they can send me a new one. Then I might have several, which would allow me to smash all of them, save the one I might prefer. I have a little courtyard that is there just for that. So I told myself, Lacan continues, that this power cut wasn't the doing of just anyone, but was a worker's decision. For my part, you cannot imagine the respect I have for the geniality of this thing known as a strike, industrial action. Nobody loves the workers as much as I, Jacques Lacan, love the workers with their strikes and industrial actions. What sensitivity, to go no further than that. A strike is the most social thing there is in the whole world. It represents fabulous respect for the social bond. On this occasion, however, this power cut that had the purport of a strike carried a slight overtone. And now we come to the interesting part. At that time of day, when I was cooking up what I would be saying to you now, how bothersome it must have been for she who, being the worker's wife, is called from the lips of the worker himself, despite everything, I do rub shoulders with them, the bourgeoisie. And you can trail that end note to figure out that he's talking about women here. It's true that this is what they call them, what men workers call them, their wives. So my mind started to wander, because all of this holds together. They are the workers, the exploited, precisely because they still prefer this to the sexual exploitation of the bourgeoisie, again, by which he means their wives. That's worse. It's the ... or worse. You understand? What a wild way to begin Chapter 13 of Seminar 19. And what a sequence of events that Lacan is reporting here. Check it out. Lacan is not ready for this lecture, apparently, because he didn't get a chance to organize his notes beforehand, because there was a power outage, because of a workers' strike, because workers are exploited. They're overworked, underpaid, reduced to wage slavery. You get the idea. All of this exploitation, however, they prefer to the type of sexual exploitation that their wives and partners endure, which is ... worse. You understand? Here's a question. Do you think that these sexually exploited wives of workers have it worse than the worse that began Lacan's morning when it got off to the worst start? I'll let you decide that one. Let's get to work, though, on this chapter. A few pages later, Lacan further clarifies what he's up to here with this masculine belief that it's better to be a man exploited at work than it is to be a woman exploited at home. He returns back to this on page 164 in a truly illuminating passage. In normal life, and of course, I'm not speaking about those blokes from the gas and electricity board who have taken their distance, who have set on labor, but rather about a life that we shall simply describe as it is everywhere, except where our great Christian overhaul has occurred. Man twiddles his thumbs, while woman does the milling, the grinding, the sewing, the errands. And in those solid civilizations that have not been lost, she still finds the wherewithal to twirl her rump for the exhilarating satisfaction of the chap beside her. At work, in other words, man is exploited, but at home he is free to twiddle his thumbs, and one thumb perhaps more than any other, while his wife actively labors away on the production of objects for his surplus enjoyment. You heard it right there. Meals, clothing, household items, and of course, twirled rumps. Part 2, piece of ass. Even when hunting, Lacan goes on to quip, men do nothing, he says. They passively wait for game to come their way. So here it is. Wives and quarry alike, from others to objects to partners to parts to pieces of ass, and all to help the masculine subject feel whole, complete, singular, autonomous. In short, like a real man. If you've got ears to hear, Lacan is once more rehearsing the master's discourse. S1 in the position of agent, upper left-hand quadrant. Here is the ignorant and idle master, read man. S2, the other, addressed by this idle, ignorant master. In the upper right-hand quadrant, here is the knowledgeable and industrious slave, read women, their wives. And to help masculine subjects deny the truth of their subjectivity. All of this, which is also the truth of feminine subjectivity as well. It's true for all subjectivities in the neurotic sphere. barred, divided, lacking, and desirous subjectivity. Now we arrive at the truth of the master's discourse, barred subjectivity, which you see in the lower left-hand quadrant. So what about that formula? The one that reads, there does not exist anyone whose enjoyment negates the phallic function. Here's what it amounts to. We are all bags with holes in them. No matter how many meals, outfits, household items, and pieces of ass we command others to fill our lives with. And that's just it, I believe. Masculine lives, like those of would-be masters, are always lived at the level of the commandment, their own especially. The master, we learned in Seminar 17, says, I speak and the world works. The man, we are learning here in this Seminar 19, says, there is oneness and I am it. This second pronouncement, because we're reading 19, interests me. There is oneness and I am it, as we queued it up in our last lecture. Masters don't think. And even when they try, it's never themselves that they try to think. But they also never shut up. And it's always themselves as masters that they're struggling to speak into existence. There is oneness and I am it captures this aspect of mastery very well. It's this discursive practice of saying oneself again and again, one S1 right after the other, that distinguishes masters as masculine subjects. Masculine subjects mired in the fantasy of autonomous, authoritative, and exceptional manhood. Symptoms. They also swarm with S1s. And symptoms also say themselves into existence. But note the difference. We know what symptoms say when they say themselves into existence. They say, I'm not it. They say, I ask you to refuse me my offering because this isn't it. This symptom is not the unconscious truth that commanded it to sound off. Now, the masculinized master, they say just the opposite with their S1. With their master signifier, they say, there is one, not two, and this one is me, not you, not someone or something else. Note that difference. The symptom always says there is two. There is I, the symptom, and that which commanded me, the unconscious truth. I'm not it. The masculinized master says, on the contrary, there is only one, and I am it. Now let me try and sum this up in a couple of clear and coherent claims that we'll then have to unpack. First, oneness only exists in compulsory reflexive speech. There is oneness, and I am it. And I have no choice but to say this again and again. Second, this compulsory reflexive speech shows exactly how the impossibility on display in Lacan's first formula of masculine subjectivity, there exists someone whose enjoyment negates the phallic function, how this first formula founds the universality at work in his second formula of masculine subjectivity that says all men are subject to the phallic function. Now, I said we got to unpack these. I mean it. Let's take them each in turn. To illustrate the first claim about compulsory reflexive speech, return to that terrific page 162. Rather than read the whole thing, though, let's just focus on a few lines from 162. The one does not think itself, even all alone, but it says something. And this is even what distinguishes it. So the one here is a speaking one, and that's what distinguishes it. We now have to inquire further about the nature of its discourse. The one says what it has to say, must say. Not what it possesses in order to say, but what it has to say. In the Parmenides, it is the one that speaks itself, that says itself. It says itself. It has to be said in aiming to be true. Hence the tizzy that naturally arises from it as a result. One more riff, and then I think you'll get it. When the one articulates itself, the only thing that arises from it is that, and then he's got a French expression that means there are not two. For the one to speak itself as it must do is for it to effect the statement, there are not two. You can read the French. There's a pretty helpful endnote there. It's toward the bottom of page 162 for us to consider. But I think that's enough. You can work 162 on your own. Those are the key bullet points, I believe, that help us support the idea that oneness only exists in compulsory, reflexive speech. If the symptom says there are two, namely the symptom and the unconscious that commanded it, the masculine master always claims the opposite. Here it is again. There are not two. Or if you want to fuck around with the French, as Lacan invites us to do, there are none of them. There is not, the masculinized master says, the part of truth that can be said in symptomatic expressions and the part of truth that cannot be said because it is unconscious. These two are not, the master claims. Instead, what you have is the singular autonomous truth of oneness, which the best of the best, to be distinguished from the rest, mind you, can't help but pronounce, especially about themselves. But there's more to this delusion of grandeur, I think, than simple self-aggrandizement. We can't just stop there. At stake here, as ever in Seminar 19, is the status of the phallic function. You see it in all of Lacan's formulas of sexuation. That's what's at stake in Seminar 19, is the status of this function. Does it exist? Yes. No one denies this. Can it be negated? Here's the disagreement. Up to this point, I've told you that men wager yes, the phallic function can be negated, while women, when they show up, prove the opposite. It cannot be negated. There is no one in existence whose speech or action at the level of enjoyment negates the phallic function. Hence, Lacan's two upper formulas of sexuation, the backwards capital E formulas. That's what we're talking about here. But notice, at the end of chapter 13, where we find ourselves, we're finally starting to see the structure and the significance of this masculine wager that you can indeed, at the level of enjoyment, negate the phallic function. When masculinized masters proclaim, there is oneness and I am it, they're not denying that the phallic function exists. Pay attention here. Rather, they're denying that it is inescapable. In other words, they're denying its status as the truth of human subjectivity and sexuation in particular. And all, again, by way of spoken discourse in master signifiers. Master signifiers that they weirdly believe proves their point. And you know why I say weirdly here, because again, the supremacy of the phallic function is nowhere more apparent than in speech. whether you are naysaying it or not. To speak is to be castrated, and thus squarely positioned in the symbolic, which is to say subordinate to the phallic function. It's here, at the level of speech, in which one, and only one, can say that the phallic function is not the truth, that masculine subjectivity is grounded. Again, let's find a passage to help us out with this. 168 is terrific in this regard. It's the final riff in chapter 13, and it's worth some attention from us. It has to do with the relation that this one, Lacan says, which has to be counted on top of the rest. Better, best, and the rest. This one that has to be counted on top of the rest. It has to do with what this one bears to what is specified, and what I describe not as a stand-in, but as being deployed in the locus in the stead of the sexual relation, as there exists not the phallic function, but the fact of saying that this phallic function is not the truth. And then he hits you with the formula for the father. Now, that's a wild sentence. If you read it without the little inserted passage, it's a little bit more clear. It has to do with the relation that this one, which has to be counted on top of the rest, bears to what is specified as there exists not the phallic function, but the fact of saying that this phallic function is not the truth. It's from here that arises the one that means that this formula has to be put on the side of what founds man as such. And this is the only characteristic element. Now, I'm going to let you mess around with Lacan's use of the French found. It's operative here. English does a good job of capturing this. The translators are all over this as well. Check out some of the endnotes that support this chapter, I believe right from the start here. To found means to establish, but also to melt. There's a very real sense in which the one can only be established or founded by a melting of multiplicities. It's at work here as well when he talks about the founding of man as such here on page 68. So when I say that it's men, masculine subjects, that distinguish men and women on the belief that men have access to something that makes them better off than women, who, according to this logic, would have it worse, it's this formula which says the phallic function is not the truth that I have in mind. This one that we just read Lacan developing. But again, there's that hitch. There's just no way to say this, to naysay the phallic function without inadvertently proving the opposite, namely its supremacy, especially when it comes to men attempting to say otherwise, which only proves the truth of Lacan's second formula. This all men are castrated, and the cycle continues. I think this is the reason why the S1 of the master always arrives in a swarm, again and again. And again, this is why I read the figure of the exceptional man as a fantasy figure, because the manhood it purports to represent is impossible, which is to say, real. And now we are right at the bone of Lacan's thought in all of this. The backwards EX formula that says there is someone in existence whose enjoyment negates the phallic function, this is a statement of the impossible. And not just any kind of statement of the impossible. It's a mathematical statement of the impossible. That's what this formula is. The real it figures is what Lacan on page 163 clearly calls a mathematical real. I think this is why it's useful, to reclaim that phrase real one, as in he a real one, as Lacan also invites us to do in Seminar 19. What I'm after here is the notion of a real one whose existence as such, because real, is strictly mathematical. And this, I believe, is the centerpiece of Lacan's thought at this point. For him, this is exactly what's at stake here. There is no other existence of the one, he tells us on page 165, but mathematical existence. All this talk of the one, all this talk of its relation to existence, comes down to a question of mathematical existence. There is no other existence of the one than that of mathematical existence. It's explicit. It's right there on page 165. You can check it out. Only in mathematics, in formulas that function as statements of the mathematical real, is it possible for any one to claim that the phallic function is not the truth. According to Lacan, this insight marks a significant advancement in analytic theory and technique. Now, I told you that he never loses sight of this throughout, and I don't think he does. Remember, at this point, he's also delivering the psychoanalyst knowledge and a kind of alternate Seminar 19 across town to junior clinicians. He has every bit of this year focused around analytic experience, the analytic discourse, the role of the analyst, and the like. And he thinks that all of this business around the one as strictly mathematical is helpful in this regard. And I want to show you a passage where he really spells this out, and then some. It's on page 163 of Seminar 19 that we're reading here. It's a terrific passage, and it shows us once more that Lacan thinks what he's up to here amounts to a significant contribution to analytic theory and technique. Check it out, page 163. Training oneself to distinguish what is involved in the one and relating it to this real, which is at issue in that it supports number, will already afford the analyst a great deal. So you've got the one, you've got the real, and you've got the characterization of the real as a mathematical real, where number is the sign. And Lacan is saying this is going to afford the analyst a great deal. Look where he goes from here. I mean that it may come to him from the angle where it is a matter of interpreting, of regenerating meaning, of saying things which are thereby a little less circumvented, a little less shimmering than all the damned stupidity that can occur to us. Earlier, I gave you ... or worse, a sample of this on the mere basis of this morning's aggravation. Here he's talking about his aggravation at not being able to get his notes together because there was a workers' strike that cut the power. But the workers would still prefer that to being at home twirling their asses for their partners. You see, this is the morning's aggravation to which he's referring. I could have embellished, just like that, on the worker and his bourgeoisie, by which he means the wife, and drawn a mythology from it. Besides, it got a laugh out of you, because when it comes to this sort of thing, the field is vast. There is no shortage of meaning and truth. Add knowledge, add ontology, add all of the damn stupidities he has in mind. It has even become the academic feeding trough. There is so much of it. There's a wide range of it. Such a wide range of it that one day someone will come along to make an ontology out of it. As I told you, an ontology to say that I said that speech was an effect of filling in the open gap that I've been articulating as there's no such thing as a sexual relation. that can be rattled off smoothly just like that, a subjectivist interpretation, because it cannot be brought round to the fact that it requires some spiel. It's all quite straightforward, this damn stupidity. What I've been trying to do, Lacan continues, is something different. It's to ensure that in your discourse, the analytic discourse, you include less of this damned stupidity. I'm speaking about the analysts. And to do so, that you try to air a little meaning, air meaning a little with elements that would be somewhat novel. And that's the wager here. He thinks that what he's doing at the level of the mathematical real around this notion of the one that supports number, all this business, amounts to a kind of aeration in which you can air meaning a little with elements that would be somewhat novel. Somewhat novel is how Lacan characterizes what he's up to with the mathematical real. So here it is, by way of conclusion for us. Knowledge, meaning, truth even, ontology, all are damned stupidities in need of aeration, perforation, in order to allow nutrients, other than those available at the academic feeding trough, to reach the roots of analytic discourse, and in so reaching, allowing something more vigorous to grow for analytic theory and technique. How about returning the master's one to the mathematical one, and the latter to a series of analytic ones, from -1s to zeros made to count as one to swarms of symptomatic S1s? You ask me, I think that's just about enough aeration to do this work of introducing something novel, at least for today.